January 14th, 1944, 23,000 feet above Simpson Harbor, Rabaul. First Lieutenant Robert Murray Hanson scanned the sky through the scratched plexiglass of his F4U Corsair's canopy as 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers droned below him toward the most heavily defended Japanese base in the South Pacific. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine rumbled with its characteristic deep-throated growl, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, the most powerful radial engine ever mounted in a single-seat fighter. His squadron, VMF-215, the Fighting Corsairs, flew top cover, 8 gull-winged fighters positioned 4,000 feet above the strike package. Standard doctrine: maintain altitude, preserve energy advantage, wait for the Japanese interceptors to climb up from their airfields below. Then Hanson's wingman's voice crackled through the radio. Bandits, zeros. 2 o'clock low, climbing fast. Hanson's eyes snapped right. What he saw made his jaw tighten. Not 2 zeros, not 5. At least 20 Mitsubishi A6M fighters clawing for altitude in a spiral climb from Lakanai Airfield. The morning sun glinted off their distinctive elliptical wings. They had spotted the Avengers, they were climbing to intercept, and they had position. Standard Marine Corps fighter doctrine was clear: maintain altitude advantage. Use the Corsair's superior speed and diving ability to make slashing attacks. Never get slow, never get into a turning fight with a zero at low altitude where the lightweight Japanese fighter could exploit its superior maneuverability. But Hanson had already calculated the geometry. The zeros would reach the Avengers in 90 seconds, maybe less. 18 lumbering torpedo bombers carrying the war to Japan's most critical forward base. Slow, vulnerable, loaded with ordnance that would turn them into flying funeral pyres if the zeros reached them. 23-year-old Robert Hanson had been in the Pacific for 7 months. He had already scored 5 confirmed kills. He had been shot down once, paddling for 6 hours in a rubber life raft before rescue. He had watched friends die. He understood what would happen if those zeros reached the Avengers before VMF-215 could intercept. What happened in the next 8 minutes would either validate everything the Corsair had been designed to do or prove that superior technology meant nothing without the courage to use it beyond the limits everyone believed existed. Sometimes doctrine isn't written by the men who have to fight. And sometimes survival requires betting everything that you understand your machine better than the engineers who built it. By January 1944, the F4U Corsair had been fighting in the Pacific theater for 11 months. Chance Vaught's radical design promised capabilities no conventional fighter could match. The inverted gull wing, the massive 13-foot propeller, the long nose stretching ahead of the cockpit like the snout of a predator. On paper, the Corsair dominated every Japanese fighter in the Pacific. Maximum speed of 417 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, service ceiling above 40,000 feet, 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the wings with over 2,300 rounds of ammunition total, nearly 30 seconds of continuous fire. The Zero's Nakajima Sake radial engine produced only 1,130 horsepower. Maximum speed topped out at 331 miles per hour. Above 15,000 feet, the lightweight Zero struggled while the turbocharged Corsair thrived. But numbers on paper didn't explain what happened when bullets started flying. In the first 6 months of Corsair operations, pilots reported frustrating engagements, zeros escaping, kills that should have happened but didn't. American fighters, with every advantage on paper, somehow failing to convert superiority into victory. The problem wasn't the Corsair's speed or firepower, it was how pilots used them. Or, more accurately, how they didn't. Marine Corps doctrine in early 1943 emphasized caution born from brutal experience. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years. Its phenomenal turning ability at low speeds had killed hundreds of American pilots who tried to dogfight it on the Zero's terms. Every training manual, every briefing, every lesson-learned report hammered home the same message. Don't get slow, don't turn with a Zero. Use your speed, use your altitude. Make one pass and extend away. The doctrine was sound, It kept pilots alive, but it also created a problem that Japanese pilots exploited ruthlessly. When a Zero pilot found himself in a disadvantageous position, with a Corsair diving on his tail, he would simply roll inverted and dive vertically toward the ground. The Zero's light wing loading and low weight meant it could dive steeply without building excessive speed. More importantly, the Zero pilot knew from experience that the American fighter wouldn't follow, because American pilots had been told explicitly, don't follow a diving Zero below 10,000 feet. Don't risk getting slow at low altitude where you lose your advantages. Don't commit to a prolonged chase that bleeds your energy. It became predictable. A Zero caught at altitude would dive away. The Corsair wouldn't follow. The Zero would pull out at low level, egress the combat area, and live to fight another day. Or worse, reposition and attack American bombers from an unexpected angle. By late 1943, the pattern was killing Americans. F124 reported that 40% of engagements ended with Zeros escaping via steep dives. F214, Pappy Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, documented 13 separate encounters where Corsairs held every tactical advantage only to watch their targets escape downward. The frustration among Marine pilots was palpable. They flew the fastest, most powerful fighter in the Pacific. They had altitude, they had speed, they had firepower, but they couldn't force decisive engagements because doctrine prevented them from pressing their advantages all the way to the kill. Japanese intelligence summaries from late 1943 showed the enemy understood this limitation precisely. Captured documents translated after the war revealed their tactical guidance. The American bent-wing fighter will not follow aggressive dives below 3,000 meters. Use vertical escape maneuvers when engaged. The twin advantages of the American aircraft, speed and altitude, become meaningless if combat can be avoided through aggressive defensive maneuvers. They weren't wrong. American pilots were reluctant. The reasons were legitimate. Getting slow at low altitude against Zeros was dangerous. Spending your energy in a prolonged chase meant vulnerability to other Japanese fighters who might be lurking higher. Doctrine existed for good reasons, but doctrine also created an exploitable pattern. And in war, patterns kill. Some pilots began experimenting quietly, off-the-record flights where they pushed their Corsairs harder in dives than the training manuals recommended. They discovered something the technical specifications didn't fully capture. The Corsair could dive faster and more aggressively than anyone had told them. The bent fighter's energy retention in high-speed dives was phenomenal. You could push it past 450 miles per hour indicated airspeed and it would remain controllable. More importantly, you could maintain that speed through maneuvers, using the excess energy to position for killing shots that slower aircraft couldn't achieve. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The key insight was understanding energy management in a way that transcended simple altitude equations. A Corsair diving from altitude built enormous kinetic energy. That energy could be converted back to altitude through zoom climbs, or it could be maintained in level flight, giving the Corsair speeds no Zero could match, or it could be used to power high-speed maneuvers that kept the American fighter in a position of advantage even at lower altitudes. But this required violating doctrine. It required diving aggressively after fleeing Zeros. It required spending altitude to press attacks. It required betting your life that your understanding of energy management was better than the caution encoded in training manuals. Most pilots weren't willing to take that bet. Robert Hanson was different. Born in Lucknow, India, to Methodist missionary parents, Hanson had spent his youth as a wrestler and athlete. He became the heavyweight wrestling champion of the United Provinces. He was competitive, aggressive, unwilling to accept limitations that felt arbitrary. When he attended Hamline University in Minnesota, he continued wrestling while studying aeronautical engineering. He understood machines, he understood physics, and he understood that combat was won by those who found advantages others didn't see. Hanson joined VMF 215 in June 1943. His squadron mates described him as intense, difficult, a pilot who took dislikes easily, but whose gunnery skills were undeniable. He flew with calculated aggression that made some commanders nervous, but produced results. By January 1944, Hanson had developed a reputation for pressing attacks beyond what doctrine recommended. He dove after Zeros that other pilots let escape. He maintained combat at lower altitudes. He converted the Corsairs' speed advantage into positions where his 650 calibers could do their work. His kill total stood at 5, confirmed. Respectable but not extraordinary. What made Hanson dangerous wasn't just his score. It was his understanding of how to use the Corsairs' true capabilities, how to dive fast enough that Zeros couldn't escape, how to maintain enough energy at the bottom of the dive to maneuver for shots, how to convert speed into killing geometry. On January 14th, 1944, that understanding would be tested against 20 Japanese fighters climbing to intercept 18 American bombers, and Robert Hanson would prove that the impossible dive wasn't impossible at all. It was judged forbidden by men who didn't understand what the Corsair could really do. The mission briefing at 05:30 that morning had been straightforward. VMF 215 would provide top cover for a strike package hitting Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. Rabaul was the most heavily defended target in the South Pacific. Over 100 fighters based on 4 airfields, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns ringing the harbor. It was where the Imperial Japanese Navy concentrated its forces for operations throughout the Solomon Islands. Intelligence estimated at least 40 cargo vessels and transports in the harbor. Sinking them would cripple Japanese logistics for weeks, but reaching them required flying through a gauntlet of fighters and flak that had destroyed dozens of American aircraft in previous raids. The strike package consisted of 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Marine Torpedo Bombing Squadron VMSB 143. Slow, heavily loaded, vulnerable. They would approach at 12,000 feet, dive to attack altitude, release their torpedoes, and egress at low level. Standard doctrine for torpedo attacks that gave the crews maybe a 30% survival rate if Japanese fighters reached them. VMF 215 would fly top cover with 8 Corsairs at 20,000 feet. Their mission was simple: keep the Zeros off the Avengers. Use altitude and speed to intercept any Japanese fighters climbing to attack. Make slashing passes that broke up enemy formations before they could coordinate attacks on the bombers. Captain Harold Spears led the flight, an experienced pilot with 8 confirmed kills, methodical, professional, a leader who followed doctrine and expected his pilots to do the same. Hanson flew as second section leader with 1 wingman, standard 4-finger formation that the Marines had adopted from German tactics observed in Europe. The flight from Piva South Airfield on Bougainville to Rabaul took 45 minutes. VMF 215 climbed to altitude over Iron Bottom Sound, then set course northwest. The Avengers droned along, 4,000 feet below. Slower, more vulnerable, depending entirely on the fighters above to keep them alive, long enough to complete their mission. At 07:15, the volcanic peaks of New Britain appeared on the horizon. Rabaul sat on the northeastern tip. Simpson Harbor was a natural deep-water anchorage protected by mountains on 3 sides, perfect for naval operations, equally perfect for defense. Japanese radar stations on the surrounding ridges could detect incoming raids while they were still 50 miles out. By the time VMF 215 crossed the coast, every fighter at Rabaul would be scrambling. The Zeros would be climbing, and the geometry of the interception would determine whether the Avengers survived to strike their targets. Hanson checked his fuel, 90%. His ammunition counters showed full loads, 400 rounds per outboard gun, 390 rounds per inboard gun, 2,360 rounds total. His engine instruments were normal, oil pressure, 70 pounds per square inch, cylinder head temperature, 320 degrees. The Corsair was running smoothly. Through breaks in the clouds below, he could see Simpson Harbor, grey shapes of ships, smoke from morning cooking fires in the Japanese installations. The harbor looked peaceful from 23,000 feet. It wouldn't stay that way for long. The Avengers began their descent toward attack altitude. VMF 215 maintained position above. Captain Spears's voice came through the radio. "Smooth and professional. Heads on a swivel. They'll be coming up. Stay with your section leader." Then Hanson's wingman called it bandits, 2 o'clock low, climbing fast, and Robert Hanson saw 20 Zeros, spiraling up from Lakunai airfield like a swarm of angry hornets. They were 4 miles away, 8,000 feet below, climbing at what looked like 2,000 feet per minute. The math was simple and brutal. They would reach the Avengers in less than 2 minutes. Captain Spears made the call. All sections. Engage bandits. Maintain altitude advantage. Make one pass and extend. Standard doctrine. Sound doctrine. Doctrine that would let half those Zeros survive to attack the Avengers. Robert Hanson had a different idea. He pushed his throttle to war emergency power. The R-2800 roared. He rolled, inverted, and pulled through into a dive that pointed his Corsair's nose directly at the climbing Zero formation. His airspeed indicator began climbing. 300 miles per hour, 320, 350. His wingman hesitated, then followed. The rest of VMF 215 executed textbook high-side passes from altitude. Hanson was diving into the heart of the enemy formation at an angle that violated every principle of fighter combat he'd been taught. But he had calculated something the doctrine writers hadn't considered. At the speed he was building, he would reach the Zeros before they reached the Avengers. And with the energy he was carrying, he could stay with them through any maneuver they attempted. The impossible dive was about to become very real, and faint Japanese pilots were about to discover the doctrine was written by men who had never faced Robert Hanson in a Corsair diving at 450 miles per hour with his finger on the trigger. At 18,000 feet, Hanson's airspeed passed 400 miles per hour. The Corsair's controls stiffened slightly, but remained responsive. The big fighter was in its element, built for speed, designed around that massive engine and the aerodynamics to convert horsepower into velocity that lighter aircraft couldn't match. The Zero formation was still climbing. They hadn't seen him yet, or they had seen him and assumed he would level off and make a conventional high-side pass like the other Corsairs above. Standard American fighter tactics, predictable, manageable, they were wrong. Hanson adjusted his dive angle, not quite vertical, 60 degrees, steep enough to build speed rapidly but shallow enough to maintain perfect control. His gun sight, Pipper, tracked across the sky as he calculated lead angles and closure rates. The Zeros were still in their climbing spiral, tight formation, mutual support, exactly what Japanese doctrine prescribed for intercepting bomber formations. At 15,000 feet, his indicated airspeed touched 430 miles per hour. He was now moving 3 times as fast as the climbing Zeros. The relative closure rate exceeded 600 miles per hour. He would reach them in less than 20 seconds. His thumb moved to the gun trigger on his control stick. 6 50 caliber Brownings, 400 rounds per minute per gun. When he pressed that trigger, 2,400 rounds per minute of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition would converge at 250 yards. The volume of fire was devastating, but it only mattered if you could put the target in the killing zone. Speed was worthless without precision. Hanson had both. At 13,000 feet, the lead Zero finally saw him. The Japanese pilot's wingman broke formation, rolling hard right in a desperate evasion. Too late. Hanson's speed gave him options the Zero didn't have. He adjusted his dive angle slightly, tracking the braking Zero with smooth control inputs that the Corsair's powerful control surfaces made possible even at 440 miles per hour. Range 300 yards. Still closing. The Zero pilot reversed his turn, trying to force an overshoot. Standard Zero. Defensive tactics that worked against slower American fighters who couldn't adjust quickly enough at high speed. The Corsair could. Hanson's gun sight Pipper settled on the Zero's fuselage just behind the engine cowling. He pressed the trigger. 6 streams of 50 caliber tracers reached across 300 yards in less than half a second. The convergence pattern was perfect. 20 rounds hit the Zero in the span of 1 second. The Nakajima Sake engine disintegrated. The propeller separated from the hub. Pieces of cowling spun away. The Zero snap-rolled left and fell toward the jungle below, trailing smoke and fuel. First kill. Hanson's indicated airspeed was 450 miles per hour. He flashed through the position where the Zero had been and was already tracking his next target, a section of 3 Zeros climbing in trail formation. They had broken their climb and were attempting to dive away, the maneuver that had saved dozens of Zeros from Corsairs who wouldn't follow. Hanson followed. His dive angle steepened. The nose dropped to 70 degrees. Airspeed touched 460. The controls were heavy but responsive. The Corsair wanted to keep diving. Hanson let it. The 3 Zeros ahead were diving at maybe 350 miles per hour, their maximum safe dive speed. Beyond that, their lightweight construction and high-speed control issues made them dangerous to their own pilots. Hanson was gaining on them at over 100 miles per hour of closure rate. 10 seconds. 8. 6. The trailing Zero in the formation looked back. Hanson could see the white face in the cockpit canopy. The Japanese pilot realized what was happening and tried to pull out of his dive early. The maneuver bled energy but put him in a position where he could potentially reverse onto Hanson if the American pilot committed to chasing the other 2 Zeros. Tactical decision point: chase the 2 Zeros ahead or engage the one attempting to reverse. Standard doctrine said take the reversal seriously. Don't let a Zero get onto your tail, even if it means abandoning the other targets. Hanson made his choice in less than a second. He pulled his throttle back slightly. Not to slow down, to control his rate of closure. He rolled 30 degrees left and pulled lead on the reversing Zero. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as the Corsair arced through the maneuver at 440 miles per hour. Speed that should have made fine maneuvering impossible, should have. The Corsair's powerful controls and sturdy airframe made it possible. The Zero was in his sights, range 250 yards, closing. Hanson fired a 2-second burst, 50 rounds from each gun, 300 rounds total. The Zero's right wing root erupted in flames. The wing folded upward along the fuselage. The Zero rolled inverted and went down spinning. No parachute. Second kill. Elapsed time from initial engagement, 45 seconds. Hanson's altitude was 10,000 feet. He had descended 13,000 feet in less than a minute while destroying 2 Japanese fighters. His airspeed was 420 miles per hour and holding. He had converted altitude into speed. Now he would convert speed into position. The 2 Zeros that had continued their dive were pulling out at 6,000 feet, level flight, attempting to gain separation and reassess. They were 400 yards ahead. Hanson was closing at 90 miles per hour, 15 seconds to gun range. Above him, the rest of VMF 215 was engaged with the main Zero formation. Radio calls crackled. Someone called a kill. Someone else called out a Zero on their tail. The furball was spreading across 5,000 feet of altitude and 3 miles of sky. Chaotic. Deadly. Exactly the kind of multi-bogey engagement where situational awareness determined who lived and who died. Hanson ignored it. His situational awareness was focused on 2 Zeros ahead and the geometry required to kill them both before they could coordinate defensive maneuvers. At 8,000 feet, he was 300 yards behind the trailing Zero. Gun range. But he held fire. The lead Zero was 500 yards ahead. If he fired now, the lead Zero would see the tracers and brake. Better to close on both, kill the trailing Zero quickly, then engage the lead before he could react. 250 yards. Hanson's gun sight settled on the trailing Zero's engine. He fired. 1-second burst, 20 rounds per gun, 120 rounds total. The Zero's propeller stopped. Smoke poured from the cowling. The aircraft began a shallow glide toward the water below. The pilot was probably already dead. Headshot. The Corsair's gun convergence pattern was devastating at close range. Third kill. The lead Zero saw his wingman smoking and immediately broke hard left, maximum rate turn. The Zero's phenomenal turning ability on full display. At 300 miles per hour, the Zero could sustain turns that would stall most American fighters. The Corsair at 400 miles per hour couldn't match the turn radius. But Hanson wasn't trying to. He was using his speed to dictate geometry. He pulled into a climbing left turn. Not as tight as the Zero's turn, but faster, much faster. The Corsair climbed 2,000 feet in 15 seconds, while the Zero was still at 6,000 feet, trying to reverse onto Hanson's tail. Impossible. The energy differential was too great. Hanson rolled inverted at 8,000 feet. The Zero was below him, still turning, still trying to position for a shot that his speed advantage had made irrelevant. Hanson pulled through inverted into a diving spiral that pointed him at the Zero from above and ahead. The Japanese pilot saw him too late. He tried to roll away, but the Corsair was already tracking him. Hanson fired from 400 yards while still in the dive. High deflection shot, leading the target by 3 aircraft lengths. 1.5-second burst. The Zero's cockpit shattered, plexiglass and structure disintegrating under the impact of 75 50 caliber rounds. The aircraft nosed over and hit the water at 300 miles per hour. The splash was visible from 5 miles away. 4th kill, elapsed time from initial engagement. 2 minutes 30 seconds. Hanson leveled off at 7,000 feet. His fuel was at 70%. His ammunition counters showed approximately 55% remaining. He had fired roughly 1,000 rounds, 400 rounds per kill. Efficient, but not wasteful. His engine instruments were still normal despite the high-power settings he'd been using. The R-2800 was built for punishment. Above him, the engagement was winding down. VMF 215 had broken up the Zero formation. Several Japanese fighters were trailing smoke. Others were diving away toward their airfields. The Avengers had completed their torpedo runs and were aggressing at low level. Mission successful. The fighters had done their job, but Hanson wasn't finished. 5 miles to the northeast, he spotted a single Zero climbing away from the engagement, heading toward Lakanai Airfield, damaged, trailing a thin stream of white smoke. Oil or coolant. The Japanese pilot was trying to make it home, trying to survive, trying to land his damaged fighter so it could be repaired and fly again. Standard doctrine said let him go. The immediate threat to the Avengers was over. Fuel conservation was critical for the flight back to Bougainville. Chasing a single damaged Zero was poor tactical judgment when there might be other Japanese fighters in the area. Robert Hanson didn't follow standard doctrine. He pushed his throttle forward and turned toward the fleeing Zero. The Japanese pilot saw him coming and pushed his own throttle to maximum, but his aircraft was damaged. Speed, maybe 280 miles per hour. The Corsair was indicating 350 and accelerating. Hanson climbed as he closed the distance, using his excess speed to gain altitude without losing the pursuit. At 9,000 feet, he was 1,000 yards behind the Zero, still closing. The damaged Japanese fighter was leaving a more pronounced smoke trail now. The pilot was pushing his engine beyond safe limits, trying to reach the airfield before the American fighter caught him. He wouldn't make it. At 800 yards, Hanson could see Lakanai Airfield ahead, runway visible through the haze, anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the field. Japanese pilots had learned to lure pursuing American fighters into the range of those guns. Let them chase you toward home. Let them get focused on the kill. Then watch them get shredded by friendly flak while they're fixated on their target. Hanson had studied the captured Japanese tactical documents. He knew the trap. He also knew he had maybe 30 seconds before the Zero reached the protective umbrella of those anti-aircraft guns. 600 yards, the Zero pilot looked back. Hanson could see the face in the mirror. Young, maybe 20 years old, probably terrified, definitely aware that he was about to die. 400 yards, gun range. But Hanson held fire. The angle was poor, the deflection too great. Wasting ammunition on a low-probability shot was how you ended up empty when you needed your guns most. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 300 yards. The Zero pilot tried one last desperate maneuver. He snap-rolled right and pulled into a dive toward the airfield, trying to get low where the Corsair supposedly wouldn't follow, where the American pilot would break off rather than risk getting slow near the ground with anti-aircraft guns tracking him. Hanson rolled after him. The dive was steep, both aircraft accelerating. The Zero was pulling 320 miles per hour now. Hanson was at 400. He closed the distance in seconds. Range 200 yards, dead astern, zero deflection. The Japanese pilot had committed to his dive and had no energy left for evasive maneuvers. Hanson's gun sight centered on the Zero's cockpit. He pressed the trigger. 1 second burst, 20 rounds per gun, 120 rounds total. The Zero's canopy exploded. The aircraft rolled inverted. The nose came up briefly as dead hands gripped the controls. Then it fell. Straight down. Impacted the jungle 3 miles from Lakanai airfield with enough force to scatter wreckage across 100 yards. 5th kill, 5 Japanese fighters destroyed in 8 minutes. 1 American pilot in 1 Corsair diving faster than doctrine said was safe. Operating at altitudes doctrine said were dangerous. Converting speed into killing geometry, that doctrine said was impossible. Hanson pulled out of his dive at 4,000 feet. Anti-aircraft fire was tracking him now. Black puffs of exploding shells. He pushed his throttle to war emergency power and turned south, away from Rabaul, away from the flak. The Corsair accelerated rapidly, 400 miles per hour, 420. The anti-aircraft fire fell behind, too slow to track a fighter moving that fast. At 5,000 feet, Hanson rendezvoused with the rest of VMF 215. Captain Spears's voice came through the radio. Terse, professional, all sections. Form on me. Heading 140, Angels 15. We're going home. The flight back to Piva South took 50 minutes. The Avengers had scored multiple hits on Japanese shipping. 2 cargo vessels confirmed sinking. 3 others damaged. VMF 215 had destroyed 7 Japanese fighters with no American losses. Textbook, successful strike mission. But when the Corsairs landed at Piva South and the pilots climbed out of their cockpits, the ground crews noticed something unusual. Hanson's aircraft had expended significantly more ammunition than any other fighter in the flight. His engine cowling showed signs of extended high-power operation. His airframe had been pushed hard. The intelligence officers who debriefed the mission were skeptical at first. 5 kills in 1 engagement, all in less than 10 minutes. The math seemed implausible, but Hanson's wingman confirmed the first 2 kills. Other pilots from VMF 215 confirmed seeing multiple Zeros going down in the area where Hanson had engaged. Gun camera footage, when developed, showed at least 3 confirmed impacts. The kills were credited. 5 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros destroyed, all in a single mission, making Robert Hanson an ace in a day, one of only a handful of Marine pilots to achieve that distinction in the entire Pacific War. But the kills themselves weren't the significant part. What mattered was how he had achieved them. The aggressive diving attacks, the high-speed maneuvering, the willingness to chase Zeros through maneuvers that doctrine said were too dangerous. Hanson had demonstrated that the Corsair's true capabilities exceeded what the training manuals acknowledged. Within days, the story spread through Marine fighter squadrons across the Pacific. The Fighting Corsairs pilot who dove into a Zero formation at 450 miles per hour and came out with 5 kills. The impossible dive that worked. The tactics that violated doctrine but produced results. Some commanders were alarmed. High-speed diving attacks into enemy formations were reckless, dangerous, likely to get pilots killed. The doctrine existed for good reasons. Caution kept pilots alive. Other commanders saw the potential. If the Corsair could really maintain control and combat effectiveness at those speeds, it opened tactical options that hadn't existed before. The ability to chase down fleeing Zeros, the ability to convert altitude advantage into inescapable pursuit, the ability to force decisive engagements instead of watching enemies escape. The debate played out in ready rooms and briefing tents across the South Pacific, but the results spoke for themselves. Robert Hanson had demonstrated something that changed how aggressive pilots thought about using the Corsair. The impossible dive wasn't impossible. It just required understanding what the machine could really do. Hanson himself said very little about the mission. When asked about his tactics, he shrugged and said he followed the Zero because it was trying to escape. When pressed about the high-speed dives, he noted that the Corsair handled well at 450 miles per hour if you understood how to manage the controls. When questioned about violating doctrine, he pointed out that 5 dead Zeros seemed like a reasonable justification. His squadron mates described him as matter-of-fact about the whole thing. No bragging, No false modesty, just a pilot who had done his job and expected to do it again tomorrow. And he did. Over the next 16 days, Robert Hanson would score 15 more kills. 20 total Japanese aircraft destroyed in 17 days. A killing spree that earned him the nickname Butcher Bob and made him the most successful Corsair pilot in Marine Corps history. But it was the mission on January 14th that mattered most. That was the day he proved the impossible dive worked. The day he demonstrated that doctrine, while valuable, wasn't gospel. The day he showed that superior technology only mattered if pilots had the courage to use it the way it was designed to be used. The F4U Corsair had been designed from the beginning as a high-speed fighter, the most powerful engine available, the largest propeller that could be fitted, aerodynamics optimized for speed rather than maneuverability. Every engineering decision pointed toward creating a fighter that could dominate through velocity and energy management. But engineering potential only mattered if pilots exploited it. And for the first year of Corsair operations, doctrine had prevented that exploitation. Caution was understandable. The Zero had killed hundreds of American pilots. The lessons learned from those deaths had created a doctrine that emphasized survival through discipline. Robert Hanson's mission on January 14th, 1944, changed the calculation. He proved that the Corsair could fight aggressively at high speeds, that it could maintain combat effectiveness through dives and zoom climbs that lighter fighters couldn't match, that superior energy management could overcome superior maneuverability if the pilot understood the principles well enough. The tactical impact rippled through Marine fighter squadrons over the following months. Pilots began studying Hanson's approach, how he used speed to dictate engagement geometry, how he converted altitude into kinetic energy, and then used that energy to maintain combat effectiveness at lower altitudes, how he forced Zeros to fight on the Corsair's terms instead of letting them escape when the situation became unfavorable. Not every pilot could replicate Hanson's success. The tactics required exceptional gunnery skills. The high closure rates meant you had very little time on target. Miss the first shot, and you might flash past your target before you could set up another firing pass. The high speeds also meant less room for error. A control input that would be minor at 300 miles per hour could be violent at 450. But skilled pilots who adopted the aggressive diving tactics saw their kill ratios improve. VMF 215 as a squadron became known for pressing attacks beyond what other units considered prudent. Their loss rate was actually lower than more cautious squadrons because the aggressive tactics allowed them to force decisive engagements quickly rather than getting bogged down in prolonged dogfights where superior Japanese numbers could prevail. The data told the story. In the 6 months before Hanson's January 14th mission, Corsair squadrons in the Solomons averaged about 2 confirmed kills per loss in air-to-air combat. In the 6 months after, the ratio improved to nearly 4-to-1. Some of that improvement came from better tactics across the board, better coordination, better training. But the aggressive high-speed diving attacks pioneered by pilots like Hanson played a significant role. Japanese intelligence noticed the change. Captured documents from mid-1944 showed revised tactical guidance for Zero pilots. The American Corsair fighters now pursue aggressive dives. Previous escape tactics are ineffective. Avoid engagement when the enemy possesses altitude advantage unless supporting bombers or in significantly superior numbers. That guidance was an admission of defeat. If Japanese fighters couldn't safely engage Corsairs that had altitude, they couldn't effectively intercept American bomber formations. The tactical situation had shifted. The Corsairs' technical advantages now translated into combat advantages because pilots were willing to use the aircraft's full capabilities. Robert Hanson didn't live to see the full impact of his innovations. On February 3rd, 1944, just 20 days after his 5-kill mission, he was shot down while strafing a Japanese lighthouse on Cape St. George. Anti-aircraft fire damaged his aircraft. He tried to make a water landing in rough seas. One wing caught a wave. The Corsair cartwheeled and disintegrated. Hanson went down with his aircraft. He was 23 years old, one day before his 24th birthday. His final kill total stood at 25, all achieved in 6 months, all in the F4U Corsair, making him the most successful Corsair pilot in Marine Corps history and one of the top American aces of World War II. The Medal of Honor was presented to his mother 8 months later. The citation mentioned his boldness and disregard for personal safety, his willingness to engage overwhelming odds, his effectiveness in destroying enemy aircraft. But the citation didn't capture the real significance of what Hanson had accomplished. He had proven that the impossible dive wasn't impossible, that the Corsair could fight aggressively at speeds that doctrine said were too dangerous, that superior technology only mattered if pilots had the courage to use it beyond the limits that cautious men had established. The legacy extended beyond the Pacific War. Post-war analysis by Marine Corps tacticians studied Hanson's missions in detail. His energy management principles influenced jet fighter tactics in Korea and Vietnam. The concept of using speed and altitude to dictate engagement geometry became foundational to American fighter doctrine. The idea that initial position advantages could be pressed aggressively rather than conservatively changed how pilots thought about air combat. And today, the F4U Corsair is remembered as one of World War II's most effective fighters. Its 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft stands as one of the best records of the war. Over 2,000 Shani Japanese aircraft destroyed, less than 200 Corsairs lost in air-to-air combat, numbers that reflected both superior technology and superior tactics. But those tactics didn't emerge fully formed. They were developed by pilots willing to push beyond doctrine, willing to risk their lives, testing what their aircraft could really do, willing to bet everything that the engineers had built more capability into the Corsair than the cautious training manuals acknowledged. Robert Hanson made that bet on January 14th, 1944, 23,000 feet above Rabaul, diving into a zero formation at speeds that should have been suicidal, converting altitude into kinetic energy, converting energy into killing geometry, converting the Corsair's theoretical advantages into 5 dead Japanese fighters in 8 minutes. The impossible dive that proved doctrine was written by men who hadn't yet discovered what the machine could really do. Sometimes the manual tells you how to survive, but winning requires going beyond survival. It requires finding the edge where capability meets courage, and betting everything that you understand your machine better than the men who designed it ever imagined. 5 zeros destroyed without losing speed. Because Robert Hanson understood something fundamental about air combat. Speed isn't just about going fast, it's about having options. Options to engage, options to disengage, options to maneuver, options to kill. And the F4U Corsair, when flown by a pilot who understood energy management and wasn't bound by doctrine that prioritized caution over aggression, had more options than any fighter in the Pacific. The gull-winged, bent-wing bird that whistled death through Japanese-held skies, fast enough to catch anything, powerful enough to destroy anything, tough enough to survive anything. If the pilot was good enough to use it properly, Robert Hanson was. And for 8 minutes on January 14th, 1944, he showed the world what the impossible dive really looked like. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.